Welcome to our MarketRX session, the commercial growth curve, why most products stall before they scale. Today, our founder, Holley Miller, will be speaking with Andy McGibbon, VP of Strategy and Business Development at Vitestro, about how to design adoption before launch so your growth curve accelerates out of the gate instead of the flattening the way most forecasts quietly do. Andy has sat on both sides of the table. He spent years at Sonder Capital backing early-stage medtech before joining portfolio company Vitestro. Vitestro is building Aletta, an autonomous robotic device for diagnostic blood collection. Aletta is CE marked for use in the EU. The company is now in the process of planning their US commercial strategy as they work through their regulatory pathway. Andy brings the rare vantage point of an investor who became an operator. With that, I'll hand it over to your host, Holley Miller, founder of Gray Matter.
Thanks, Amitra. Hi, everyone. I'm Holley Miller. I founded Gray Matter nearly 20 years ago to solve one of the hardest problems in healthcare, not building innovation, but getting markets to adopt it. Most CEOs assume product superiority plus sales readiness equals launch success. Yet 2 out of 3 launches fail, even if they start strong. That's what we call the product adoption lie. The real issue isn't execution, it's belief. The market hasn't internalized why the status quo is no longer acceptable. And you can't manufacture that conviction after launch. You engineer it before. The companies that create new standards of care and capture outsized returns make engineering belief central to their commercial strategy. Andy is doing this right now at Vitestro, well ahead of a prospective US launch against the highest volume invasive medical procedure globally. And that's why he's here. Welcome, Andy.
Hi, Ollie. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I've known you for several years, starting when you were at Sonder Capital. When launches flatlined, and you've probably watched plenty from the investor seat, where does the leadership team usually point the finger? And maybe the real question is, how often did anyone seriously ask whether the market believed it was a must-have product?
Yeah, great question. And I think, rarely is it really pointed to the market belief as the point of challenge. And I think that really comes down to, look, we're doing all this great stuff. Why, the market should just understand that, right? I mean, that's what they believe. They should already know that we have the data, we have the product that's superior to whatever it is we're competing against. And I think it rarely takes that level of understanding to go out and say, no, you know what? Actually, there's some missing pieces of the puzzle here that we need to fill in.
Yeah, it's interesting. One thing we hear a lot after, a launch, usually out of the gate, is like, we're crushing our initial, launch projections. But I think the real question, we have to ask is that going to be sustainable? And in the launches you watch closely, did the market resistance decline by itself, or did the teams just kind of keep selling harder against that same wall?
Yeah, I mean, it's really a complicated topic here. I think obviously that's why we're talking about it here. But I think when you look at what's happening, it's just not just a function of time, right? So you go out there, say you have a better product, you're starting to get a little bit of traction. First couple customers might be relatively easy. You've probably had some conversations leading up to your commercial launch. And then there's a couple different trajectories that happen. I think one trajectory that I think is a very frequent pitfall that I saw when I was on the investment side is basically lining up all the innovators. If I go back to the idea of the adoption curve, there's people that are out there that are just excited about trying new technology, and it's great. They're important stakeholders. They're important references at some point in time. And so you might actually get a pretty strong signal very early into that sales curve of saying, look at all this demand we have. But then all of a sudden you're saying, wait, why aren't we now getting that next wave? Why is it flatlining, or even worse, why is it kind of stalling out and declining? And sometimes that's just the fact that you have this pipeline of innovators. But more frequently, it's just because you're not listening to what the market is telling you about feedback on your product and your sales process. And so, yeah, exactly as you say, okay, well, we have the data. Again, you come back to this idea, but I have the data that shows it's, X% better than the technology that's out there. And you just try harder. Maybe it is a new sales rep that we need. And so I think it takes a level of thought a little deeper than that to really get into what is the challenges with your launch.
Yeah, if I just say it louder, you'll maybe hear it the next time, right? Yeah, it's interesting because I do think sometimes it's like your baby's beautiful, right? Like you can't see it any other way. You're so close to the product, the technology. Technology. Oftentimes, it's even more pronounced with the founder, kind of CEO, who really has been living with this vision and this technology for a very, very long time. And I think there is that often fundamental disconnect with it'll just be obvious, and with enough evidence, enough rational proof points, then they'll come around. The interesting thing, it seems like, especially for VC-backed companies, is that your burn is highest at exactly the moment the forecast was really built to kind of take off, right? And so if you're not seeing that early traction in the market, then it's very difficult, I think, for a commercial team and a board to kind of sit back and recognize there's been a bit of a mismatch of that forecast execution and your burn rate.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it makes sense, right? You're founder, you obviously had the belief in the first place, the conviction to spend your time and energy, and you managed to convince some other people that this was something worth spending time and money and resources on. And so you're kind of surrounded by people who have bought into the vision. Especially on the internal side of the table, whether it's your board, your investors, your team, everybody's already bought in there. And most likely you're picking up market signals saying, yeah, this is exciting, and here's the reasons why. And so that's what you're listening to. I think that's great. And again, that needs to be there. Part of what we've been spending most of our time at Vitestro on is trying to find those voices that aren't saying that and go out and find those dissenting viewpoints, because ultimately that's really what you need to understand is, beyond those people that get it very quickly, because they're out there, but you got to get to that next level, and what are they going to object with? Why don't they believe that this is something that is meaningful for them to adopt? And trying to understand those is such a crucial part, and frankly, that's something you can do really early in the development of your company and the technology. You can start finding those voices very early, and so you don't want to lose sight of that.
You make a great point, Andy. So, to your point, you've, of course, sat on both sides of the table, investor and operator. Looking back, though, did you see signals around market readiness? To your point, it's not like it's a blind, a black box that you don't know. It seems like you can, a lot of companies maybe underestimate, is the market ready? Maybe they're not looking for the right signals, or they just are so bullish about the big TAM, the unmet need. We've got great data. Surely people will, kind of react as we expect. So do you think there are signals you can read, and do many companies just underestimate those?
Yeah, no, I think that's, yes. I mean, it's always hard, right? It's probably a combination of art and science to be able to get to that. And I think, yes, I mean, again, if I kind of layer on how we're doing this at Vitestro today, like much of that is on the one hand, you have the data, you can demonstrate some kind of advantage. I think that's table stakes, and we'll kind of talk about that. But I think you do have to have some element of advantage over the existing status quo. And so, what are the things that you need to start exploring to understand what that gap might be? Those are really important pieces of the puzzle. And so, I think, for example, going and talking to a customer, and you get or a prospective customer, and depending on where you are in that regulatory journey, but like really understanding, hey, you have an internal champion, and that's great. But typically, and especially with category creating companies, it's not just that one stakeholder that matters. And so a pretty easy signal to pick up is that person in the second call, that they're wanting to set up, or the second meeting, are they just wanting to find out more? Or are they saying like, wow, this is something that could really change how we practice medicine in whatever way it is? And so are they bringing the stakeholders from their side that are going to matter in the ultimate decision making? And I think that's one that, again, it comes back to this idea of somebody saying, yeah, your baby's cute, right? It's such a pretty baby. But ultimately, you need them going and telling everybody else how pretty your baby is, right? I mean, it's not just that relationship, but it's really a multi-stakeholder sale, and that's such a critical element.
You make a good point. We talk about, what does it take to cross the market belief threshold, which is, how do you really get to go from those very early adopters to kind of this early majority and then mainstream, as you mentioned. carrying that narrative without you in the room is a great example of that. But a lot of times it sounds like people stop kind of when they hear what they want to hear. I know in radiology, there's a term satisfaction of search, which is I'm looking at an imaging study. I hypothesize that someone fell out of a tree, they broke their arm, they're in pain. When I see that break, I stop looking because I've checked the box. And so it sounds like in your experience, it's not uncommon for people to say like, hey, I'm looking for someone to say this is an interesting idea. That's not the same thing as saying, wow, this would be transformational. I need to go, talk to people about, getting involved in the study, or, getting, being one of the first sites to test this, or being, first in line when it's commercially available. It seems like there can be a real disconnect between, perception and reality in the market.
Yeah, and I think that same logic kind of exists on the investor side, right? I mean, if I kind of put my investor hat back on and say, interesting company, interesting technology, I need to go find out why this isn't going to work, because ultimately that's what I'm trying to understand. If I believe the vision, it's going to work. So why is that vision not going to fall apart? And so go out, do a couple diligence calls, and you might hear, oh yeah, that's really interesting. That very exciting, great data would be something I'd take a look at. That's what you hear from the clinical person that you might be on the phone with. There might be a list of questions that are answerable usually, right? I mean, maybe not today, but with an easy study or two. And then you're like, okay, wow, yeah, that's great feedback. But actually, again, like keep digging and understand, that there's other elements to here. It's not just that superficial layer that matters so much. So again, I think just this idea of like dragging people into that situation where they're not just saying like answering questions of, oh yeah, here's my checklist. Yeah, it needs to have better data. It needs to be faster. It needs to be safer, et cetera. But really then kind of transitioning to the next step and being like, well, at least on the investor side, when you're doing the diligence call, you get the question like, so what is the company's website? What's the name of the can I buy this today? And when you start hearing those kinds of signals, that's very exciting. And I think it comes back to this idea you just talked about of like once they're bought into that, once they get that belief, they know there's that problem. And obviously there's more work to do after that initial call. But I think really being able to get into the level where they're then bringing the right stakeholders and bringing that enthusiasm. And I think in your language, like that belief that this is something meaningful and impactful, that's really where you kind of separate things out.
Well, if I'm not mistaken, you were the investor, but then you were exposed to Vitestro, and that you heard something, there was some type of signal in the market that you heard that you thought, I'm going to shift to the operating side. So what was that like for you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like as an investor, there's some great parts that I loved about it. Getting to speak to so many entrepreneurs working on such cool things, every day. Of course, you can't invest in a lot of those, but it's still like really, it brings a lot of energy and enthusiasm about how medicine is going to look in the future, right? The problems that people are solving, impactful, really, personally sometimes too, right? You think of family members. The thing what separated out with Vitestro for me, and part of what inspired me to make the jump specifically to Vitestro as I was kind of considering moving over to the operating side, every conversation I had with the customer, they already exhibited some of the behavior that we're talking about in terms of that belief. It was like, every conversation wasn't just that sounds really interesting, but here's reason X, Y, and Z why it's not going to work. Every single time I was like, wow, that's really interesting. Like, tell me more. And it kept getting to tell me more. And then it started getting into anecdotes where you're like, this is such an unsustainable way of practicing medicine today. We're talking about diagnostic blood draws, and it's, there's billions done every single year. And then you look at how we've been doing it for ages, it has remained unchanged. And you start hearing this aspect of inevitability, right? They're like, I knew this was going to happen. We literally had people say these kinds of things. Like, I knew it was just a matter of time, and it looks like now is the time for this kind of technology to take over. And so you started getting that idea that they were already bought into that belief, and part of that was because there was some conversations, that educated them about, we can get into the full scope of what we educated them on, but like about the solution, about what the value props are, about really the benefit to healthcare. But just hearing that enthusiasm really, inspired me to jump over.
I love that. And you just kind of hinted at something, which is, It's often not a single person that's making the decision. You've got to really get some alignment with external stakeholders that can be different departments, different motivations, different incentives. And so how you got to get all of them to say the status quo is indefensible, as you said. This can't stand, right? And so I guess to your point, like, what are the signs you guys saw that distinguish that just from people being nice and being like, sure, I'll meet with you if you're in town, Andy, great.
Yeah.
But there had to be something that you guys have said, like, if you guys are serious, these are the things we look for. Is it you get all those, the financial, operational, clinical people in the same room? They got to be at the table and be in the meeting before you kind of can check that box. How have you looked at that? Because I can see that people can mistake some of those signals of they're really into it when they're actually just really being polite.
Yeah. And that's something that I would say our CCO, our Chief Commercial Officer here at Vitestro, has been very good about that, about really kind of holding true to this. Look, if you're going to be one of our early partners, we need you to buy in. We need that belief to be present. And so, one of the ways that is exhibited in our approach is when we look at our collaboration partners, and I won't go into the full detail of how we're approaching the market right now, but essentially as we're going through who our early collaboration partners are, one of the key things is like, is our internal champion, whoever that may be, and it might be a clinical person, it might be, in our case, it might also be more an operational person. Finance is a very important stakeholder, but whoever that internal champion is that is leading this effort to engage with us, are they then on the second meeting and the third meeting saying, like, I know that ultimately to get this into my system, to get this into my health system, I need these people bought in, and am I bringing them along in the journey? Like, that's, and so we're pretty explicit about that. And I think, again, it's just another tactic that you can use to really start de-risking some of that market belief and understand really where people fit up on that scale of, like, are they really bought in or not, is seeing, like, are they willing to go and bring their operational or financial counterpart into the next meeting, where you can go through and already start understanding what are the things and barriers, objections that we will run into. And so again, for us, that's been such a critical part, because we have built out something of a commercial team relatively early. If you compare us, if you benchmark against other companies, it's a little bit earlier than many, but it's really because long sales cycles in capital equipment, number one, but number two, to be able to understand this dynamic, give the collaboration partners that we can kind of square them up on the innovation curve, so we're not overweight one way or another, but really then starting to weigh that against how are they bringing in their counterparts. What are the other stakeholders, whether they're clinical, operational, or financial? What are their objections going to be, and how can we, build the evidence that we need to mitigate their concerns for adoption? And I think that's been a very intentional thing that we've done, and I think that's also a strategy, like I say, that works pretty broadly, is just being very true to yourself and not, frankly, wasting your time or the other party's time by saying, like, oh, I'm going to spend. This person's really excited, and so naturally that's going to pull me towards that. But if I'm only talking to the people who are exciting, I'm never getting that level of understanding that I really need to get to for broad adoption in the market.
You make a great point, a couple points really, which is, one is, a lot of companies will say, like, this is a great product, it's addressing an important need, but until people really saw that sense of urgency to make a change, that's a kind of a first rung on the ladder, if you want to think about it that way. You guys have clearly pinpointed something that they really believe this is urgent and needs to be fixed, and what we currently have, the status quo, isn't good enough, right? Yeah. But you're looking at visible proof points too, right? Those are kind of like market signals that maybe we can go from one person to a system to a region to become the standard of care.
Yeah.
And it's not a switch you flip. You guys are doing a great job of finding the emotional kind of pain point first. Then you're giving them the data that allows them to have the conviction to kind of walk through that door and say, this is the future we've seen, that we want to keep moving with you and working, partnering with you guys. And I think, to your point, you're doing this pre-launch in the US, which is great because you're able to use those behavioral signals in Europe potentially to help inform a US strategy. But I have to believe that there are signals that are there, negative signals, a leadership team's not acting on it. And now you are going to be facing a very expensive mistake, post-launch, because you are misaligned with your internal alignment as a contrast to that external conviction. So, is there a moment where you feel like leadership teams saw something and either didn't act on it, or maybe wanted to think they saw it and acted on it, and it came back to haunt them?
Is there an example, or how much time do we have?
Protect the guilty. Yeah, you don't have to say names.
Right.
We'll protect the guilty here.
Yeah, no, but I will, not poke too many bears here, but I think there are real, again, if I come back to a founder, the early team for a company has spent so much time and energy devoted to building something, and the table stakes are a better something. I mean, you're not gonna get very far if what you're starting with and what you're going to build is not better than the status quo. That's just not something that's done. So you already have something that's better. And now, the question, like, if you think of the types of risks you're typically mitigating as you go through the evolution of a company, the earliest is usually the technical. Clinical kind of fits in there too, depending on how things go. And so those are the easiest. It's easiest to say, can you build it? And does it work the way you want it to work? Like, those are kind of the easy ones to solve for. And so you start this early stage, and you say, like, look, we did all this work to prove that we can do it. We ran some studies that shows that it's X% better than what's going on right now. And you're like, okay, well, that's success, right? We checked the box. We're better. We're a better product. And so now we just need to go sell it. But again, that's not really addressing the needs of the customer, where you start saying, and again, I'll come back to the stakeholder idea, because I think it's a very important one. And I'll mention an anecdote with Vitestro on that. But I think, so a good example, not Vitestro, but in a different clinical area, existing technology failed, like a different approach to the treatment failed miserably. Patients universally did not like it. The caring clinical people did not like it. It was really difficult to use. So it just kind of died on the vine. It was just never there. Fast forward, new technologies, lowering cost of technologies. You have a whole new way of doing this. It's quicker treatments. It's better complication profile. The user elements of it from the clinical perspective, super easy. So, it's like, okay, well, look, we did all this. We have this data. It's better. I can show you. We did this study that showed it's faster. The patients are treated quicker. The time of the procedure itself is also shorter. And you go out to the market and you find a couple true believers that are like these innovator types. And that worked really well for the first 3 sites. And then all of a sudden you start getting into a situation where it's like, now you have to go convince the rest of the market, and they're still stuck 20 years ago on a failed technology. And so, that groundwork to not just convince your early customers, but really be able to set yourself up for scaling future commercial success. And I think that's the missing piece, is like the idea that if you are going to be successful, yes, the launch and the early customers are so critical, but you can't stop there. The job is not done there. Just like the job isn't done when you build a prototype. You now have to convert that to a product. The job is not the initial sales. You now have to show that it's universally loved and adopted across health systems throughout the US or globally, whatever the scope might be. And so I think it's that kind of, you're not quite there. You got to get a little further. And so with Vitestro, I just coming back a little bit to the example as well, one of the things that we found, yes, there's this like more emotional piece. So if you look at the diagnostic workflow, so 70% or so of clinical decisions are at least informed by a blood draw. Hugely impactful. And so, if you look at the clinical people, they're like, errors are a huge problem. Our absolute error rates are actually pretty low, but for them personally, they look at this diagnostic workflow and they're like, we have solved the error problem after the blood. I mean, I don't want to say we solved it, but like really significantly impacted the error issues after the blood draw has been taken. The one manual step that remains is the blood draw. And that's for them still the highest source of errors. So for them, it's like, this is the thing I want to solve. I need to solve that. But now, and one of the things that we've learned is by taking this approach of making sure that we're engaging a broader set of stakeholders, we started bringing in the operational folks, and they're saying like, oh yeah, this is great. I'm so excited that they're excited, but now I also need it to check these boxes. But specifically the one that we've really spent a lot of time on is now on the finance side, because now we're talking about, especially for bigger category creating technologies, it's a system level sale ultimately. You have to really think about how the health system, not just the individual hospital, not just the individual clinician is focused on this, but the health system. And they're like, capital allocation matters. And so you need to make an economic case. And so we've worked really hard to try and understand what are the drivers that they're focused on, and try and de-risk that as soon as possible. And I think if we started that work much later, I think you'd run into this problem where you start getting you got these great champions of your technology, you got a great champion of whatever product you're bringing to the market. And then all of a sudden you try and make the sale and you can't convert it because now you didn't think about what those. And so what often in that case, the pattern tends to be, oh yeah, well, let's just find new customers. Let's just go here, there, and, like sell harder, speak louder, whatever it is you need to do. But actually that's not what is killing your deals. It's a different stakeholder and what their needs are. And that's where I think you sometimes miss these signals if you don't do that work up front of really understanding stakeholder perspectives.
Well, that's a great insight, because to your point, a lot of times, again, people are like, we check the box with the clinician or the clinical champion. We're going to launch, into the market. We're going to spend a ton of money and we're going to get rapid adoption. To your point, you're probably going to get like an initial bump, right? You're going to get that kind of, the early adopters who are excited, that little kind of bolus that was building up, that are curious about your technology or your solution. But then, it can flatline. And so I think what I hear you say is like, it's okay to go like slow to go fast, like this idea of, really understand the conditions that have to be in place and intentionally address them so that all this, the stakeholders can check the boxes around an urgent problem that they believe will actually create massive, upside for them, and the ways that matter for them, versus, hey, we found one dimension that works for this one stakeholder and we're just going to see traction take off. It sounds like that's often, a red flag, and you'd rather kind of have this intentional kind of slow start than a false start. Yeah,
and I think there's probably an art and a science to it in terms of the exact timing, and it's so situational depending on the opportunity. But I do think that there's a general rule of thumb that you can apply about how far in advance. I think 18, 24 months, something like that, where you can really have enough time to make the markets move, convince, get that belief engine going, not just where you're instilling that belief, but also letting those people who now are believers spread that on to their peers. So I think there is that kind of window that's there. But the challenge, and you alluded to this earlier, but the challenge with waiting too long is you run into a situation where it's so expensive, again, because now you built your entire capital, like you're a startup company, you've built your entire financial model on how are you going to build this company to a position where you don't have to keep raising money, whatever that looks like. And frankly, every time burn goes up, right? I mean, every month, every year, you're only getting more and more expensive to run the company. And so if you're getting to a point where you're about to launch the technology, you're getting into that commercial phase, and you got some good, early sales, some good signals, but you haven't done the work that you need to up front. You get in a situation where now not only are you having to fund what was on paper your plan with whatever forecasted trajectory of sales you have, which is again expensive because that is implying growth and therefore growth in headcount. But now you're also realizing that, first of all, your revenue is not where you expected it to be. So again, just thinking cash flows for the company, that's a challenge. But also you're probably going to have to do more investment to generate that belief. And that's not something you just flick on, right? Like it's not just a flip a light switch and all of a sudden people are going to be doing this. This is like really that ongoing work to generate the belief. So I think it becomes so expensive to wait too long. The trade-off is, you probably don't want to go too early, because the question is, it takes a unique profile, I think, of commercial people who know how to do this, who understand how to do this, or partners like Gray Matter that understand this work and can do this up front. And so finding that balance is really something that's very critical to do. Not too expensive, either doing it too early or doing it too late.
Yeah. So to your point, like order matters, right? You got to do that work ideally before you launch. And then to your point, like timing matters. And just, to clarify for everyone, we're not talking about product marketing. We're really talking about problem marketing, right? You're talking about, here's the status quo. Here's what's wrong with it. If you could do this, kind of setting the agenda for the new category, that's what you're really getting people to kind of nod their head at and buy into. So when your product is available, they've already defined the new agenda, the new standard, which is obviously you guys. So,
Yeah.
so on that note, you guys are obviously creating a new category, autonomous, robotic phlebotomy. I think some people might find this fascinating, right? Because you are redesigning one of the maybe oldest, kind of unchanged medical procedures in the world. It's also, though, I think you said like one of the highest volume, invasive medical procedures, billions being performed annually. And I can imagine many of the stakeholders you guys talk to maybe think, well, blood draws work like well enough, right? Like there's nothing really obviously broken. No one's, up at night being like, oh my God, if there was just a different way to, take blood. So I guess, how do you design the conditions that make the existing standard feel inadequate before you have a US cleared product?
Yeah. Yeah. And this is where again, I probably sound like a broken record talking about stakeholders, but it's such a critical element in something that is so, it impacts so many different areas, not only within a hospital, but also patients, right? So everything you said is absolutely right. And by the way, this is a pretty intimate procedure in terms of like, you got somebody putting something in you while you're like in your arm while you're conscious. I mean, and so as far as invasive procedures go, being done so commonly and so, it's still invasive. There's like really a patient perspective here. And so, it's interesting if you go next time you're at a dinner party and you feel like getting some reactions, ask them if they'd have a robot draw their blood. And seeing the spectrum of responses there, you get people who are like, absolutely. Last time I went in, I had a huge bruise. It took 5 needle sticks, etc. I mean, so the problem, and I think this is the important thing you just referenced too, like it's the product versus the problem. When we look at blood draws, like for me, for example, I'm a relatively easy stick. And so I'm like, okay, go take the blood. I'm also one of those weirdos that watches the needle go in and watches the blood come out. So there's a lot of people that aren't that way. And also if you look at so from the patient experience, and that's actually where the company really originated, was looking at the patient experience. And by the way, it evolved from saying like, in order to impact the patient experience, you have to address the needs of the health systems. And so that was really the evolution. So in some ways, this idea is ingrained into the ethos of the company. But then if you look at like the different stakeholders, the problem that they see with this is different, but they still all have pain points. And I think one of the interesting learnings I've had from that perspective is, as common as blood draws are, they're not really like, to your point, they're kind of just like, okay, yeah, it's done all the time. It's not a big problem. But actually, because it's such a high volume, even small numbers of challenges, like if I come back to this idea of clinical quality, hemolysis rates, for example, they can cause the inability to read the blood samples. We've got anecdotes of mislabeled tubes, like wrong patient on the wrong tube. Like there's actually severely impactful issues with the workflow in the way that it's done today. But it's not any one stakeholder that has a view of all that set, because the clinical folks are really focused on, here's my blood sample and here's what my results are. And so they're thinking quality, they're thinking error rates, all those kinds of things. But then you have the operational people who are like, hey, I'm trying to plan out how to get X number of patients' blood drawn every single day, and phlebotomists are hard to find, they're hard to keep, no shows, call outs, these are all very common challenges. Healthcare shortages are prevalent everywhere, and phlebotomy is no exception. And so they're sitting here saying like, okay, I just want to get you your blood sample. I hope that it's good enough quality, but like I need to make sure that I have enough people to address the patient. So every single stakeholder has a different problem set in there. But yeah, ultimately, like there are those strong pain points. And so when we go talk, we know we very much focus on who is our audience when we're going to talk to a health system. Are we talking to the clinical people where this is really a focus on clinical performance? Is this the operational person who really is focused on throughput and how you can get patients through the system? Is this the financial stakeholder? So we really modify what our emphasis is depending on that on that stakeholder.
Well, you alluded to this. You have essentially at least 4 stakeholders. You have, I guess, lab managers, probably pathologists, phlebotomists, patients, like, they're, as you were saying, they all care about somewhat different things. You're trying to thread that needle, well. I guess two questions. One is, who's the hardest to win, and is that also the one that has the biggest impact, on kind of moving market belief? So that's my first question. The second one is, a lot of times when you introduce something truly different, not better, to your point, really different, you may not be able to measure it in the same way, right? So like if it's, I don't know, first needle stick, if it's cost, if it's speed to treating patients, is it accuracy? I'm saying, like, in your mind, how have both kind of measuring success and building that trust with different stakeholders, different incentives, how have you guys threaded that needle?
Yeah, it's I think we're in a pretty unique position from this perspective because it's a European company. It's based in the Netherlands. We started there, technology was developed there really in close partnership with a few hospitals there more than health systems. And, it's just a different healthcare system. And so we have the advantage of really understanding clinical and operational stakeholders. I think we had that, because of the evolution of the company, the European perspective. Yes, it's the European perspective, but it's still, from a clinical perspective, it's first stick success rates. It's like, is there an error in my sample? These kinds of things, like those are global. It's not a geography based consideration. Operationally, it's different, but still directionally similar. Financially, just a different mindset, completely different mindset. And so, we haven't truly engaged in the commercial discussions, right? Like, we're pre FDA approval. We can't go sell the device today. But like, as we're going through these stakeholder discussions, I think that's been one of the trickiest ones for us is really the financial side. And it comes back to this idea that you just mentioned. We're changing things. And so if I go and ask a health system, what is your cost per blood draw? They're going to say, well, my needle costs this much, my vacutainer costs this much, and my tourniquet costs this much. And that's about it. And frankly, that's a pretty low number. and it would be very difficult to build a business case to automate that. And which is why I think that it's been so hard for so long for any kind of new, truly disruptive technologies here to take off. The biggest innovations are a new needle geometry, which helps patients. It has better pain scores, for example. But it's still needle. And so I think the translation to coming to the US and saying, like, where are the hardest discussions? And this is anticipatory on my side, because again, we haven't had these commercial discussions. Like, I think that's the one where you ask them how much a blood draw costs and they don't know. They can't tell you because they're telling you what this cost of consumables is. But actually there's labor costs, there's the cost of error rates, like a variety of errors. It's not just hemolysis. And so, like, you can start going through, and that's the work that we've done with our collaboration partners, is really done a health economic analysis that does the combination of things. One, it's really trying to extract for the different stakeholders, what are their pain points, and can we capture the value by addressing those pain points? Two, it's getting all those stakeholders involved, because not the clinical person doesn't really have access to, just say it doesn't have access to the same data set that the operational or financial people do. And so what we've done is basically worked in partnership with a variety of health systems to come up with a cost per draw. And, at the end of the day, that's a financial metric, which will satisfy a financial stakeholder. But to get to that point, that was probably the better work and the harder work of actually doing that, because we're engaging those stakeholders, and they're the ones that are really starting to then talk internally about, wow, well, I didn't think about this. And so if you stack all those together, actually a cost per blood draw is really, really quite different. And so that's the thing that we've done, I guess, coming back to this idea of belief engineering and how we've tried to work on, educating the market. We're not replacing the consumables. Like, we're changing how a blood draw is done. We're moving from a one patient to one phlebotomist to one phlebotomist overseeing multiple patients and these kinds of things. And so it's been a real learning, and some translated well geographically, but not everything.
Well, you make a good point, which is, I guess, the idea of you're kind of challenging the premise, right? Of like, here's how it was, but why? So there's lots of examples, over time, this idea of like, why does a patient have to be in the hospital to have their vitals monitored?
Yeah.
Why does a patient have to prick their finger to, measure their blood sugar? Why does a surgeon have to be scrubbed in? Like all these, things that sound crazy, but it took one company to say, let's challenge that. And then it reframes how people think about the problem and how they think about the solution. And then, if you do your job, then you can own that because you're the only one that can satisfy that. So I like the idea of what you're saying, like it's different, not better, not, incrementalism. It's really, look, we're now, we were talking, analog, now we're digital. And so we gotta truly think differently and kind of move forward together. So I like that. You mentioned though that, it's deliberate work you have to do to engineer that market belief before launch, which does require some level of capital investment up front before you have revenue to show for it. So how much, at a lot of companies this stage, all they're thinking about is manufacturing and regulatory priorities. The idea of investing in a third, pillar either isn't budgeted or it's not even on their radar. So why do you think leaders can't afford to skip that belief engineering work before?
Oh man, yeah, that's a hard one. Because I think we have made that very intentional choice to invest in this, and I'm optimistic that pays off on the back end, right? Because now that really changes the trajectory of your commercial ramp, and or gives you a higher degree of confidence in what you did project. That is immensely valuable, especially when you come back to this idea of how expensive time is at that point in time in the company. But yeah, it does take, it takes some effort and resources. You can't just kind of, come back to this idea of time will tell, and we got the evidence, so we'll come up with a couple papers, publish those, and that should fix our commercial launch. That's perfect. No, you have to convince yourself, your team. You have to convince your investors and your board that this is something worth investing in. And I think, my belief is there are so many more examples of where this didn't go right than there are that did go right, that it should be a relatively easy case. And I kind of alluded to this. I think it was on LinkedIn or something talking about this, but I strongly believe that one of the reasons there's such a lack of, we're always talking about medtech funding and how hard it is to raise money, and it's always hard to raise money. But one of the hardest areas to raise money is like that pre-commercial. It's basically the period of time when exactly what we're talking about comes to fruition. It's like nobody wants to fund that. Oh yeah, your initial commercial launch. They want to see the first 10 million of revenue. They want to see the first 20 million of revenue. It depends on what you're working on, but usually that's the drawing line. Or they're earlier than that, and they're hoping that somebody else. There's like this gap in funding, and I think it reflects exactly this, that we as an industry haven't really done a good job overall. I guess put a different way, there's more times where we haven't done that well than we have done that well, which caused some beliefs to form on the investor set that this is just not the area that they want to invest the capital in because of the risk profile. So I think you got to find, but I think that's changeable, and I think you can do that, and you got to point to the examples of where it did go well and why it went well, and time will tell on us. Like, we're still in the middle of it, but I'm very optimistic that this investment will pay off, and I think of just like, if I again put my investor hat on, the ROI on those dollars is actually quite high because you can apply whatever discount you want to that future cash flow. But in any case, your burn down the road is very high compared to what it is today. So I think that ROI actually works out pretty well.
That's such an astute point for us to kind of wrap up this section on, because I think to your point, what you just described, which is preparing the market before the burn rate climbs, before the sales team is hired, that's really what separates those companies that beat the product adoption line, ones that don't. And as you said, the data is like alarming if you think about how often companies fail. Even though there was a huge TAM, the product was superior, it had, all this data. That is not what actually unlocks market adoption. And so I love that you spent this time with us talking about your own experience, your perspective from both sides of the table. And I'm really excited to see what happens with the company. I think you guys have really set yourselves up for success, and I'm looking forward to watching your product launch in the United States and seeing how you're able to translate some of the behavioral signals that you saw in Europe, and then we're using that lens for the US market. To your point, they're not apples to apples per se in every kind of data point or element, but the idea is, as you were saying, you've got to get them to believe the status quo is no longer acceptable, give them a reason to get behind it, and make it seem like this is the only rational way forward. And that's an emotional decision, not actually a rational one. And so I think you guys have done a great job, kind of tapping into that in the EU. And I think it sounds like you guys are really well set up for success when you guys do eventually get to the US market. So look forward to seeing that.
Yeah, thanks. Very exciting times ahead for us. And I think, we're, like I say, very excited about the product that we're working on, the problem we're trying to solve, and very excited about market's enthusiasm. And hopefully we can continue to educate the market on why this is such an impactful problem.
Thanks, Holley. That brings us to the close of today's session, and a huge thank you to Andy McGibbon for sharing such direct, hard-won perspective from the pre-launch front lines, and to Holley Miller for guiding the conversation. As we wrap, I'll leave you with a challenge. If your launch forecast assumes the market will eventually get it, what are you doing to make that happen? If you aren't doing anything, why are you expecting the market to change? And I'd also like to invite you to join us again in September, where we will have Todd Pope from Revival Healthcare Capital joining us. But in the meantime, stick around. We are going to have Andy join us again for a little more casual Q&A. So that wraps the main session. If you have questions, please don't forget to drop them in the chat. And we're really looking forward to hearing more from Andy just after this. Thanks.
Sorry. You survived. Just kidding.
That's right.
It was honestly really, really great. And so I'm sure there's a lot of questions queued up, I guess, because I think there's a lot. You guys are doing something most people don't. So I'm excited to see what we have in store.
Yeah, very excited.
When you say a launch flattens because of belief, not execution, oh yeah, how do you tell the difference inside the company while it's happening?
Yeah. It's a great question.
The person who's having shots in the back corner, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Well, I think it's tricky, and I say it's what makes it particularly tricky is thinking about the evolution of a company, right? And we talked about the founder story of how they're coming from this belief, but the company also has a transition to make as it makes it closer and closer to commercialization. And early on in the company's lifespan, the voices that are most listened to are technical, and so you build this culture that is, well, let's just take Vitestro for example, and without giving specific numbers, probably 80+% of our workforce is engineering. It's a complex robotic device, so we had to do that, right? But now we're transitioning it to commercial, and we have people out in the field. And I think that's the most important thing, is like really understanding your customers, getting that feedback, and just as we said during the main session, really probing on why this isn't going to work is so important. And you will have voices in the company that probably understand this because they're the ones that are out there talking to the customers and they've heard the stories. And so I think it's really about having as much as possible, not just an invitation, but like really a mandate for those people who are out in the field to come back and report their experiences to the company. So that's something that we do very frequently. We even have our customers come in and talk in like all hands meetings to really understand how the customer is. So it's really about putting them at the center and understanding what's going on there.
I love that. And one of the things we also recommend, and you guys are doing it, but it's listening to the words they use, right? How do they describe it? What do they, and I think the more you can make your stakeholders believe that you understand their problem better than anybody else, then you're clearly the ones to, to solve it. So I love that. You can't have those silos, and then you can't make it just so product centric that you lose sight of the real kind of end user.
Exactly. Yeah, that's right.
You said, go find the people who don't want to do this and find out why. How do you actually run that conversation without your team flinching?
Oh, your team will flinch. Yeah. They will flinch, and they'll probably come out of that meeting slightly depressed. Just, and I think, it is, you have to find the right profile of people, because there are some people who will take criticism or questioning probably more heavily than they should. Because again, it's not about one conversation. It's really about the aggregate. Because again, we're trying to set up, how do you scale the company down the road? And so it's not just these one-off conversations, but it's the aggregation of all these data points that are going to tell you really what it's going to look like down the road. And so you just kind of have to have the tough skin. You have to find the right profile of people to be able to say, like, look, my goal in this meeting is to find out what is the problem with my assumptions. It's really to challenge my own thinking here, not convincing them. That's, like, to me, like the part of where you really want to start from is, like, where are my assumptions? Because I've just spent all my time building this company with this embedded set of assumptions as to why this is going to be successful. Now I'm going to go talk to this person. I'm going to challenge my own assumptions. And if my assumptions are all right, they're going to believe this is a great technology because my assumptions were right, and it's a great technology, and it's a great product, and et cetera, et cetera. If my assumptions are wrong, I want to know why, so I can course correct and figure out how that feedback needs to be incorporated into the bigger story.
Louder for the people in the back. I'm just kidding. No, I mean, I think you make a good point. Every company has assumptions, right? But they are just assumptions, and you've got to go out and validate them, whether they're right or wrong. And only way to do that is to be, in the field with the people. You also alluded earlier to the, more technology adoption curve.
Yeah.
If you just do innovators, early adopters, do the two ends of the spectrum, right? Of the curve, those are going to give you the answers of how you can scale the absolute fastest and the most efficiently. And and it can't be just find people who think your idea is great, right?
Yeah.
You got to find the naysayers.
Yeah, and by the way, maybe just one quick tactic for people to keep in mind when you think about this, and again, varies situationally dependent, but like really focusing on a geography and trying to move in that geography further down the adoption curve, rather than just picking the innovators across the US. I think that, to me, at least when I was on the investor side, that was like the number one thing that I saw, where people would just overweight on the innovators side. Be like, look, we have, you all know the names, like Mayo, like these like names, Cleveland Clinic, like they're innovators. They're like super big profile names, and so you want to talk about them. But at the same time, like, you need those, and you need other perspectives.
And to your point, that's a much more expensive kind of burn trajectory strategy, rather than actually showing scale and traction and expansion within a market or even a region. To your point, that is more reproducible in other markets than just getting these kind of 1%ers and trying to hope that then kind of brings everyone else along. Doesn't work that way.
That's right. Yeah.
How do you defend investment and belief engineering to a board that wants to see those resources go to sales and pipeline post-commercial launch? Because that's the legacy playbook, right? That's how you do it, right?
Yep. Yeah. I would just flip the logic around and say, this is a direct investment in my sales and pipeline. I mean, this is, the belief engineering. And again, I guess when I think about this type of work, so much of it is actually getting out there, talking to customers, understanding their problems, building a narrative with their voice, with your voice, and like building this narrative around what is the problem that you're trying to solve. It is de-risking your pipeline. It is directly impactful on that, because, not only does it have the advantage of then, giving that belief to the market, but it's also the relationships you're building with those people as you do the work that should directly translate into sales and your pipeline, early on. So I think it's the dual purpose of it. It's setting yourself up to de-risk your commercial scaling, but also it's building your early pipeline. And I think you can those two converge quite a bit, or at least you can, emphasize how much they converge, depending on how open your investors are.
It is truly working harder, not smarter, but also working more efficiently, so that you're that's such a great come back. I'm gonna have to remember that line. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
We have time for one more. Let's see.
Yep.
Last question for Series B MedTech CEO who didn't do market development pre-launch, shame, and is now stalled. What's the fastest credible path forward? Yeah, how do you course correct, basically?
Man, that is one of the most difficult ones. The cold answer that I'm going to give is just reset. I mean, you can't spend your way out of that plan built on assumptions that are no longer true. So your entire forecast, your entire operating plan was built on these assumptions, and actually it's just not the way. So I think you need to have like that really hard look and reset, because the biggest challenges I've seen is when a reset occurs too late. Those are like the company ending scenarios. The company saving scenarios are when you make the hard decisions a little earlier. And I know that's easy for me to sit here and say in abstract, because it's still people, it's still your company, it's still there's a lot of emotions around doing that. But I think ultimately, if you're talking about survival and impact of the company and impacting patients in a positive way, you gotta just make the necessary reallocation of your resources to support that commercial launch.
And if you had your investor hat on or board hat on, like any, would you want to fire the CEO if he said that to you? Would you be like, thank you for, helping us recognize we're off course, and
Oh yeah,
this is the truly like that, not just due diligence, but like this is the smartest thing we could do?
yeah. I mean, that's exactly it, because it takes money to run a company. It takes and the more money you have to make sure things go right, the better you are. And so if you're already in a place where things aren't going right, you need to reallocate, cut whatever it is that you need to do to really spend on what helps move the company forward. And at that point in time, it's already a different set of things than you by definition have been spending on.
But you think the board and investors would maybe not be happy, but they would recognize, like they would support that type of shift.
Hopefully. I mean, usually.
If not, people call Andy. And
yeah, that's right. That's right. Right.
Well, this has been absolutely awesome, Andy. Thank you so much for sharing your insights and a little bit kind of behind the scenes of what's happening at Vitestro. I think, what you guys are doing is hard, but I do think it will ultimately not just change the standard of care, but really be a kind of a case study, a great example of how do you, kind of do it right from the beginning before maybe a traditional playbook would have you do it, which is you got to kind of build that belief before you launch so you can scale and really find that adoption curve accelerating, not flatlining or becoming anemic. And then I think also every new innovation, every new category at some point had to cross the market belief threshold. And that is not something that happens by itself. It doesn't happen organically. It actually has to be creative and designed intentionally. So kudos to you guys for doing just that.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, no, it's a lot of fun. I'm looking forward to the journey. We obviously have a great team to support the efforts, and so very excited to see what we can do when we put our heads together. And thank you very much for having me. And I'm very much looking forward to Todd's session in the or a couple months too. So
us too.
It'll be fun. Cool.
Okay, so some interesting. Don't drop. I was laughing, Andy, because have you seen those pictures of like Barack Obama?